These following stories are from my pilot season of my podcast Deliver Us. For my regular listeners, you may have heard these stories before on my channel told as they were written in the first person. I hope you enjoy this reworking of the stories and will be looking forward to new episodes coming this October, which will include all new stories never before released on this channel. Not every encounter with the paranormal is as terrifying as some may think. In some cases, people can get rather attached to the spirits that haunt their homes. This story shows us how a bond can form between the haunter and the haunted. Welcome to Deliver Us. Charles and Caroline Gentry lived in a house that dated back to 1760. They had lived in it for some time before they had started to experience anything out of the ordinary. The start of the activity was centered around a small door in their kitchen. The door was short and panelled, crude by today's standards. It hid a set of steps which led to a space upstairs, a large open room which, at the time, was unused. The door was often mistaken for an old cupboard as it didn't go all the way to the floor, but rather stopped at the top of the first step. Beyond it, the blunt risers were very steep and narrow, and the room above the kitchen was rather dank with low ceilings and a wide planked creaky floor. Prior to the events in the house, the door was always left ajar. There was a small wood block that would twist in order to keep it closed, and no matter how many times it got tightened, it always seemed to slip, allowing the door to open. They just kept closing it, over and over again, thinking it nothing more than another quirk of the old house. Eventually, Caroline, seeking to remedy the problem, came home with an antique black iron slide lock, which Charles installed on the door. That's when things started to happen. At 2:30 a.m., the couple were awoken by a banging sound coming from the kitchen. It was not a natural banging. It seemed intentional. The best way Charles could describe it was that it was like someone was repeatedly slamming a baking sheet on the table. Charles grabbed his baseball bat and with great caution and more than a little trepidation went downstairs to the kitchen. He didn't know what to expect. What he found was nothing. Nothing was out of order. All of the doors and windows were closed and locked, including the small door to the stairs. This activity repeated like clockwork for several days, the banging every night at 2:30 a.m., with no explanation. Needless to say, the couple were frazzled and confused by the events. So Charlie had their neighbour Fred, who knew everything about the house, come over so he could help him inspect anything that may be causing the slamming sound each night. Fred's wife, Mary, took an interest in the unexplained event and asked Charles and Caroline to think about anything that might have changed around the time that the sound began. Caroline explained the lock put on the door. Mary, who was a true believer in spirits, suggested that they leave the door unlocked. This sounded very strange to the couple, but they went ahead and did it anyway. From that night on, the banging stopped. Unlocking the door became a part of their nightly routine before going to bed. It had been a week and all was quiet. Charles became fascinated by the door, the unexplained noises, and how they only started when the lock was fitted. Charles was never one to subscribe to such things as spirits, but seeing as no logical justification had been forthcoming to this point, he felt he should keep an open mind to the possibility. His curiosity led him to do some further investigation into the construction of the house. The old house was unique, not only for its age, but its beauty as well. The kitchen, where the disturbance seemed to be centered, had been a summer kitchen originally. It was detached from the main house from 1760 until sometime in the 1930s, when it was joined. It's believed that the two rooms upstairs, now one large room, were used as servants' quarters initially. Caroline was not comfortable with what was going on, so wanted nothing to do with Charles's investigation. One weekend, Caroline left to visit her sister, so this gave Charles an opportunity to really investigate the activity in the house. He went out and purchased an audio recorder to see if he could capture any activity. He also invited his friend Dan over, who thought the whole thing rather silly, but agreed nevertheless. Before Dan arrived, Charles climbed the narrow steps off the kitchen to spend some time in the room above. The space was unused, mainly because they couldn't get anything up the tiny staircase, which wasn't much wider than a ladder. Once the door opened from the kitchen, it's one step up to a tiny landing, then a 90-degree turn to the right, and 15 steps up from there. Charles paced about the room. Then, he began to hear music. It wasn't specific at first, but it got a little clearer, and he recognized it as the song "I've Never Been in Love Before." He shrugged it off as someone playing it on their stereo somewhere, although he was still some distance from any other house. Still, it was the best explanation he had at the time. But it repeated, as if it were on continuous play, almost as if it were playing in his head. What confused him was that he didn't really know the song, other than to have heard the medley somewhere before. Some time later, Charles looked up the song. It was published in 1950 for the Broadway play Guys and Dolls. It is said that it's supposed to be a duet, but what Charles heard whilst in the room was not. Also, he didn't hear any major orchestra behind it. It all was pretty much just singing, as if someone was just doing it without any music. While Charles was doing his surveying of the room, he thought of potential uses for it. He thought it might be a good place for a man cave. As he was laying it out in his mind, it dawned on him why he was up there in the first place. He wasn't one to usually speak to himself, but nevertheless, he asked out loud, "Would you mind if I made this into a man cave?" In that instant, he heard the tinkle of wind chimes. That moment caused his imagination to leap even further than before. They did have wind chimes, which was on the back porch just a few feet below where Charles was standing, so it wasn't like it was strange. What took him aback was the timing. It was a still evening, so the chimes had been silent except for that moment. That night, Dan and Charles set up the recorder and camped themselves in the family room, which had clear sight of the kitchen. Hours passed, without incident, and the two of them kept to their laptops for the most part, just listening and waiting. It was 3:45 when Dan looked up from his screen and asked Charles if they had a clock radio going off somewhere in the house. Charles told him no, and asked him why. He said, "I'm hearing music." "What are you hearing?" Charles asked him. "A song," he said, and then he told Charles that he had never heard it before, so he wasn't sure what it was. Charles asked him to sing it for him, which Dan refused to do. Instead, he spoke the words, saying, "It's going, 'I thought my heart was safe,' and then, 'something strange and strong,' then something, 'she's never been in love before.'" Charles was stunned. Show tunes were nowhere on Dan's radar, so there was no way he could have made this up. It was this that affirmed to Charles that he had definitely heard the song whilst in that room in the house. At first, he thought it was just in his head, but now he was certain it wasn't just him. Now Dan, of all people, heard the same thing. Charles didn't actually recall the lyrics strange and strong, but he played the song from his laptop to Dan, and they confirmed that those words were indeed part of the lyrics. The ever-pragmatic Dan didn't like it one bit, and he left shortly after. This solidified to Charles that something was present in the house. Charles downloaded the rest of the Guys and Dolls soundtrack to play in the house. He wanted whoever was doing the singing to know he was listening. Over the following week, Charles worked on getting to the bottom of the activity. He met up with Dan so they could discuss the music they heard. They agreed that it is not inconceivable that someone was playing a recording of that specific song somewhere in the area. It seems far-fetched, but it couldn't be ruled out. There was a field along the south side of the house that runs along a subtle valley. Below that, and at some distance, were a couple of houses. Charles had experienced firsthand how strangely sound can travel across this field. For example, he once heard parts of a conversation when the distance would have it seem impossible. So the song they heard may not be anything extraordinary. Charles invited Fred over to go through the basement with him, specifically to look over the automatic sprinkler system. It occurred to Charles that it was the one thing that was on a timer, and given the irregularity of the noises and the fact that the pipes could make inordinately loud noises, the automatic sprinkler system was immediately a suspect. Yet, when they traced the pipes, they could not duplicate the sound. Either way, Charles shut the system down completely. Another thing Charles considered was that they had mice under the porch last year, and they spotted one in the kitchen. They had an exterminator come out to get rid of them. As he did such a great job the first time, Charles called him and told him they were getting a lot of noise in the attic over the kitchen. He explained that it was quite loud, so it wasn't likely to be a field mouse, but something a lot bigger. Charles added that he hadn't seen signs of rodents since his last visit. The exterminator explained that it wasn't unusual not to see them at first, and assured Charles that mice and roof rats can make a lot of noise. He also suggested, based on what he remembered of the house from his previous visit, that if Charles was concerned that rodents might be getting in, that he lay a line of flour across the entry to the kitchen, which is along the rear wall. If they find any tracks, they would know they had mice in the house. Charles gave that a try. The next morning he did find tracks, but they weren't that of mice. It was as if something had swept across the flour and then stopped. Every night since the activity started, Charles was woken at the same time each night. This happened whether he heard the banging noise or not. Caroline would remain asleep, whilst Charles would go and sit downstairs with his audio recorder running to see if he could capture something. Some time had passed, and one day Charles was pulling into the driveway when he saw his neighbours Fred and Mary. His driveway is an easement through their property, and he'll usually stop to chat whenever he sees them outside. They proceeded with their usual lines of conversation, but it quickly shifted to the activity of what was going on in the house. The conversation that followed was the final thing that convinced Charles that everything that had been happening in the house was most certainly paranormal. Fred was born in the house at the end of their driveway, and except for about a 10-year period had lived there all his life. At the time of these events, Fred was 81. Charles hadn't seen Fred and Mary in several days, and he hadn't told Fred anything about the music they had been hearing. So when the subject came up, Charles explained everything and that he had concluded that the song he heard was "I've Never Been in Love Before." Fred physically reacted to the information. He was literally taken aback. His eyes began to well up, and he took hold of Mary as if he was worried he might fall. He looked at his wife and nodded. "It's Ducey," he said. Fred and Mary invited Charles into their home, and for over an hour, Fred explained everything he knew. Ducey was the nickname of Dorothy, who grew up in Charles and Caroline's house and would have been about Fred's age. Fred explained that he and Mary had talked about the possibility of the experiences being related to Ducey, but chose not to bring it up to Charles. He said that so many years had passed, and without any other reports, they assumed, as Mary put it, that Ducey had crossed over. Ducey, or Dorothy, was a twin. Her twin's name was Deborah. There were 9 kids altogether that lived in the house then. Also during this time, the rooms in the upstairs were used as bedrooms. Deborah and Dorothy, being the only 2 girls, were the only ones to have their own rooms. The room over the kitchen was 20 by 20, and when Charles and Caroline bought the house, it was divided into 2 small rooms. They took the walls down because there had been a good deal of water damage. The story, according to Fred, is that Dorothy was 18 or 19 when she got engaged to a boy named Armand. Fred explained that Armand and Dorothy were childhood sweethearts, and that prior to their engagement Armand was always around, and that he simply became part of the family. Fred liked him very much. He said he was cunning and always making jokes. One evening, Armand took Dorothy out to a nearby town for dinner and to see a show. It was unconfirmed what show they saw that night, but considering this was during the 1950s, the same decade as the musical Guys and Dolls came out, it was highly likely that that was the show they saw. This was the same night in which Armand proposed to Dorothy. Armand worked in the fields nearby, and several days after their engagement he had an accident whilst changing part of a tractor. He was unable to get treatment in time, and as a result, he bled out and died. Fred explained that Dorothy became something of a shut-in after her fiancé's death. The house was always bustling with activity, and the only place where she could be alone was in her room, and that's where she stayed most of the time. The significance of the song I've Never Been in Love Before from Guys and Dolls is such that Fred told Charles that until this day, he can't hear it without thinking of her. He told Charles Dorothy would play it all the time. The family could do nothing to ease Dorothy's grief. Fred explained that as her siblings left to start families of their own, Dorothy remained in the house with her mother and her one elder brother, who Fred described as having some sort of learning difficulty. Dorothy stayed in her room over the kitchen, even when the larger rooms became available. The only time Fred knew of Dorothy leaving the house was when his father died in 1960. Dorothy attended the funeral with her family. Other than giving her condolences to Fred's mother, she said nothing. Dorothy died of ovarian cancer in the front room of the house around 1966 or 67. Fred remembered that her brother had said that before she passed, Dorothy asked to go to her room because it was there that she felt most comfortable. Given the configuration of the stairs and the care she required, this was not possible. At the end of telling the story, Fred became emotional. He said he felt like an old friend was lost and in need of help. The discoveries also made Charles feel uncomfortable. It's not easy coming to the realization that the house you live in is occupied by someone else. They discussed finding a solution. Mary suggested getting a medium involved, which Charles and Caroline agreed would be the best route to take. Caroline found a medium. Her name was Susan. After trading emails and several discussions on the phone, they invited her to the house. To begin with, Charles was skeptical and concerned the woman was simply trying to take advantage of them. However, after she journeyed an hour to get to them without charging them anything, he changed his mind. Susan made a connection right away, the moment she walked in the door. Only, it wasn't Dorothy. She said that she sensed two men. She called it a thumbprint and said that they weren't very receptive. She walked through the front room and into the family room. She said that the family room had been a very busy place at one time and asked about a specific wall, saying it wasn't as it used to be. The family room used to be the kitchen many years ago, before the house was joined with a summer kitchen. At that time, there was a large fireplace on the wall she was referring to. Charles only knew this from pictures and from what Fred had told him. He said the fireplace was collapsing, so it was taken down about 25 years ago. Susan then walked into the kitchen and said, "Her name is Lucy." It was close enough to her nickname, Doocy. She asked to go upstairs and seemed to know right where to go. This was interesting only because most people are surprised there are steps behind the odd little door in the kitchen, but Susan seemed to instinctively know they were there. They tried the light switch, but it wouldn't go on. Charles went up ahead to make sure everything was clear on the stairs. He found a spare bulb and changed the light, but it still wouldn't turn on. Susan asked to be left alone in the area, so Charles and Caroline went back down to the kitchen and waited. When Susan returned to the kitchen, she said that Dorothy showed her her room. Susan described it as having white wicker furniture, and the wallpaper was a pattern of huge flowers. The current occupants redecorated the house when they moved in. They painted them flat white, but when they removed the old walls in the upstairs room, they discovered flowered wallpaper under the layers of paint. As Susan had no prior knowledge of this, she instantly captured the attention of Charles. She then went on to explain that Dorothy missed the church. She said it was off in that direction and gestured towards the north. Charles and Caroline couldn't recall a church in that direction. They told Susan that it was unlikely that there was ever a church within any reasonable distance north of the house, because nothing that way had ever been developed. It had always been farmland. Susan moved on. After Susan left, Caroline and Charles sat in the kitchen, absorbing all they had learned. Charles looked up at one point to see his wife's eyes suddenly grow wide. She was looking past him, toward the north and empty wall between the kitchen and the family room. They once had a large painting of the Reims Cathedral on that wall. They gave the painting to Charles's sister-in-law as a housewarming gift because she always admired it. Apparently, Dorothy loved it too. It would seem that Dorothy was about 18 or 19 from what Susan could figure out. They know that she was in her 30s when she died, but apparently, while she was there in the house at least, she was still a teenager. It isn't uncommon for a spirit to return to an age in their life in which they were the happiest or held a certain innocence, especially when there has been a traumatic death or great sadness in their later years. Charles was pleased to discover from the medium that Dorothy liked him very much. Caroline too, only she knows that Caroline is nervous about her presence. She also liked the music that Charles played for her as well. She was aware that her mother had died, and that's why new people came in and out of the house. Susan believed that Dorothy did not realize that she too had died. Susan had a very strong feeling that Dorothy was waiting for someone, and although they didn't tell her, she seemed to understand about Armand. After everything was said and done, the couple spoke about how to help Dorothy move on. Susan said that while she is amazingly receptive, that doesn't make anything easier. They told her the story about Armand, and she said it would be critical to see about reaching him. She spoke about trying to reach Dorothy's mother and father too. She explained that they would be the best way to help her move across. Before leaving, Susan said she would return to see if she could connect with Armand and/or Dorothy's family. As Fred knew Dorothy, she wanted him there as well. She believed it would help her to move on. Charles would continue to wake every night at 2:30 a.m. He was convinced it was Dorothy who was waking him somehow. He would sit in the kitchen and would wait to feel her presence. This presence came in the form of images in his mind. It was as if Dorothy herself was placing them there. His explanation for this was that these images weren't anything particularly spectacular, more like stills from a past life. For instance, one image that he saw was a group of young people sitting on or standing beside a post and beam fence, just talking and enjoying each other's company. Another was of a man who was repairing a car. Some days passed, and Susan returned to the house with a plan to reach out to Dorothy's mother and father to see about having them bring her over. She warned Charles and Caroline that this was not going to be an easy process. She said that we shouldn't expect the results to be immediate, that it may take several sessions to reach them, if they could reach them at all. The process wasn't quite what Charles was expecting. With everything he had been through, he imagined something a little more dramatic than what actually happened. Susan didn't actually say much. She simply sat there, deep in thought, and got everyone else present to focus on the names of the people she was seeking. Dorothy's mother and father, George and Blanche. After a few minutes, Susan mentioned sensing a man, and a moment later, she said there were 2 men. What happened next seemed to Charles and Caroline somewhat anticlimactic. Susan smiled and said she felt a rush. She said there was an amazing moment of happiness, and Dorothy crossed over, just like that. Charles didn't sense anything, no feeling or changes to the atmosphere. Feeling slightly disappointed, he then proceeded to question Susan on everything he sensed. He asked who the men were that took Susan. Susan said there were no names, that she couldn't be sure, as although they briefly acknowledged her, they didn't speak to her. She assumed it to be George, Dorothy's father, and Armand, Dorothy's fiancé, but she wasn't certain. She was convinced Dorothy did know them. Charles went on to ask questions about the departure of Dorothy. Susan assured him she left happy and full of joy. In addition to the somewhat anticlimactic event of Dorothy moving on, Charles felt lost and empty, as if he never got the sense of completion he was hoping for. He was sad that after the connection he felt that had developed between Dorothy and himself, he never got to say goodbye to her. The following days, Charles felt the presence of Dorothy no longer there, and with that, a sense of grief of having lost a friend. He questioned why she left so quickly, and who the men were who came to take her. His connection was such that he couldn't help but worry about what had happened. One evening, Charles had been working late in the upstairs of the house. When he decided to call it a night, he went downstairs. Only, his feet seemed to take him on a different route than normal. He ended up in the dining room, a room very infrequently occupied by the current residents. As soon as he got there, something caught his eye on the dining room table. In the dark, it looked like a smudge on the glass. He switched the light on to get a better look. The light revealed it to be a single flower sitting there on the table. Charles figured it was something his wife must have left. He went to pick it up, but his hand slid across the glass table as if nothing was there. He stared at it, trying to figure out if his eyes were playing a trick on him. He looked under the glass, but as soon as he knelt down to find it, the flower would disappear from sight. When he rose back up and looked down at the table, he would see it again. He even looked to see if it was reflecting off something from above, but it was not there either. He took out his phone and took a photo. The flower was visible in the picture, but when he went to take a second photo, it disappeared. Charles stood there for a moment, before becoming overwhelmed with emotion. He interpreted the occurrence as Dorothy reaching out to him and to let him know she had passed and that she was okay. Charles went to the kitchen, poured himself whatever stale coffee remained in the pot, and sat there entering the meditative state that opened him to whatever images flashed in his mind's eye. Somewhere in the middle of these beguiling thoughts, Charles began thinking about Perry and Todd. Now he knew Todd's name. Fred had mentioned him. Because of all the brothers in Dorothy's family, the two were friends. Perry was also Dorothy's brother, only he wasn't sure he heard the name before this moment. After all these experiences, he didn't believe anything to simply be a coincidence. He was convinced these thoughts were placed there in some way. Charles concluded that it wasn't Dorothy's father who answered the calling, or Armand. From these thoughts, he somehow knew it was Perry and Todd who came for their sister. And in that same moment, he was certain they had been in the house for a while. They must have been the two men that Susan sensed as soon as she stepped into the house for the very first time. To get something a little more concrete, Charles sent an email to Fred asking if he remembered all of the names of each of the children in Dorothy's family. He received the following reply. Charles, you're taxing my old brain, but I do remember. The names were George Jr. Skip. I think his real name was Samuel. Todd, Thomas, Bartlett, who went by Bart, Daniel, Perry, Deborah, and Dorothy, a.k.a. Ducey. Armand's brother's name was Caleb. Upon reading the name Perry, Charles was far less shocked than he thought he was going to be. He was also satisfied his conclusions were concrete, though the flower he saw was in fact a gift from Dorothy, along with the thoughts he was given about her brothers. People often fear the possibility of encountering a paranormal presence. However, as we discovered in this story, not all ghosts are malevolent. They may simply be lost and in need of guidance to move on from the world of the living. Perhaps it is just the fear of the unknown that causes us to be afraid of such presences, the fact that we really do not know what truly lurks there in the dark. Grafton is a small town in North Dakota. Some who have lived there will tell one of 3 stories around the campfire. The first is a true and tragic story that befell Delphine and Edward Hain. In February of 1931, the Hains hosted a dinner party to 11 guests. Some canned peas served during the event were contaminated with Clostridium botulinum, the bacteria which causes the illness botulism. The Hains and all their guests fell sick, and within a number of days, all passed away. The second story is that of a group of teenagers who, for reasons unknown, attempted to summon the devil himself. The attempt failed. According to some folklore, after a failed attempt to summon the devil, a person is supposed to take their own life. One of the students followed through with this, by throwing themselves off the roof of their school. The third is a speculation that underneath the town is a network of tunnels that connected all the government buildings and major areas. How this story started, or the explanation as to why this web of tunnels would have existed is not known. It was, however, a story that would fuel nightmare tales about patients from the town's mental asylum accessing the tunnels and escaping to the residential areas and the schools. Welcome to Deliver Us. Gideon Eel has his own story about Grafton. Gideon had lived in Grafton most of his life. Although being aware of the stories growing up, he didn't experience anything until he moved out of his dad's house and into his own place. Having been to high school in Grafton, he also wanted to graduate there, so he took a job in a local department store to be able to afford an apartment whilst being in college. Everything seemed to just fit into place. The job and apartment became available just at the correct time he started school. The apartment was modest but suitable. The only thing that wasn't working at the time he moved in was the AC. But seeing as summer was practically over and autumn was on the way, he didn't think that would matter for now. First signs of activity started the first night he stepped in the apartment. After a long day of finishing off the moving in, he was tired and figured he'd sleep well that first night. Just as he was about to drift off, he was disturbed by an unusual sound coming from the corner of the bedroom, just above the door. He described it as the sound of someone running their fingernail down a comb. His eyes shot open, and he sat up. He stared at where he thought the source of the sound was for a while, and other than the sound continuing, nothing else happened. He assumed it must be something to do with the building that was causing the noise, old plumbing or the wooden construct. He went back to bed. By morning, the sound had ceased. From then on, he would hear that noise every night. Every time morning rolled around, the sound would stop. He never found an explanation for it, but after a week of living in there, he had gotten used to it as simply a quirk of the apartment. Some time passed, and Gideon met Melissa. They dated for a while, and the relationship blossomed quickly to the point where the young couple decided to move in together. It was when Melissa moved into Gideon's apartments that the activity started to change. The first difference was the sound that occurred every night began to fluctuate in volume. The sound had until this time remained at the same volume and in the same location. The location began to shift from above the bedroom door to above the closet that was situated on the same wall, but far enough to notice a difference. Inside the base of the closet was a small pile of Melissa's books and belongings that were temporarily being stored in there after she'd moved in. The morning after the shift in positioning of the sound, they discovered the books and belongings were soaking wet. That's it, Gideon thought to himself. It has to be a plumbing issue. He began to feel around the area to see where the water could have leaked from, but he struggled to find the source. The walls, ceiling, and floor surrounding the closet were all dry. It was almost as if someone had opened the closet and poured water straight onto Melissa's belongings. Melissa was annoyed by the damage, but luckily, everything that was ruined was replaceable, so the couple went about their day. The most dramatic change to the sound occurred the following night. It started the same as it usually did, and then the volume began to increase. It got so loud it filled the entire room, and was difficult to determine where the sound was coming from. Gideon and Melissa lay there, frozen in terror. Then the volume decreased, and they were able to place the sound again. At first, it was back above the door, and then it started to move along the walls until it placed itself above Melissa's side of the bed. Unable to bear the noise any more, they got out of bed and dragged the mattress and bedding out of the bedroom and into the living room. This was where they would sleep from now on. The noise, however, still could be heard emanating from the bedroom each night. Although Gideon could never explain the noise, there was something that prevented him from concluding something paranormal. He owned 2 cats at the time, and having the belief that animals are sensitive to paranormal occurrences, he was assured by the fact that they weren't reacting oddly to the events. Gideon and Melissa settled in. Gideon, still being at school, would leave for the day, and Melissa would stay at home. Despite Gideon's assurances that there was nothing to worry about, she always felt uncomfortable in the apartment alone, so she would often spend time out and about walking in the town. She was still new to the area, so she thought this would be a good way of getting to know it better. As soon as she went outside and encountered other people, they would always harass her. It didn't matter who it was, teenagers, adults, the elderly. They would yell names at her for no reason. They were complete strangers, and for no reason they would just hurl abuse. Gideon insisted that the exploration walks would have to happen when he was there as well, to ensure Melissa's safety. The first night he took her out, Melissa's claims were confirmed when a car drove past with several young men inside, and they shouted something indiscernible at the couple. Gideon was taken aback. He had lived in the town his whole life, and had never before seen this type of behaviour. They carried on with their walk, discussing the goings-on in the apartment. Gideon explained the noise heard in the bedroom at night reminded him of the noise created in the horror movie The Grudge. Melissa had never seen it before, so Gideon convinced her to pop by the video store on the way home to rent the movie and watch it that night. Upon watching horror movies, our imaginations have a tendency to run wild, making us see and hear things that are not really there. There are, however, schools of thought that believe that entities will use the fear we experience when putting ourselves through watching horror movies to feed off. So, that shadow you saw moving in the corner of your vision, the presence you felt in a bedroom, or that noise you heard in the middle of the night after watching that scary film, may not just be your imagination. During the watching of the film The Grudge, the noise in the bedroom could be heard, fluctuating in volume and moving around the space. That night, it sounded like it was able to leave the room and start to move around in the corridor. Several evenings later, the couple were going for their evening stroll. During their walks, they would experience hearing the sound of footsteps behind them. They would turn around to look, but they wouldn't see anyone. This one particular night, they came across a house that had all the lights off in the rooms except one. They saw a figure of a woman standing in the window. As they got closer, they were able to see that she was staring directly at them. She did nothing but follow every move with her eyes. They continued with their walk and found themselves near the town's mental institution. It was dark, and feeling adventurous, they explored the area a bit. They discovered a graveyard on the grounds. Opposite the institute was a park. It was deserted, so the couple found a secluded spot to stop for a while. They sat on the grass and kissed. Their passionate moment was interrupted by a loud scream from deep within the park. It didn't sound human. Gideon was convinced it was a hyena and went searching for the source of the sound. He didn't get far before he saw it. A dog-like creature, hairless and standing on its hind legs. It rose from its hunched position, staring directly at him, and then ran off into the night. Gideon ran back to Melissa and urged her to leave with him as quickly as possible. The couple got themselves home. Melissa was desperate to know what Gideon had seen, but he wanted to ensure they were back in the safety of their own home before saying anything. Melissa was starting to come to the conclusion not only was there something not quite right about the apartment she had just moved into, but the town of Grafton itself. The cats that lived with them were indoor-outdoor animals. Gideon believed in giving them their freedom to come and go as they pleased. The next strange occurrence happened when, one day, Melissa and Gideon were both home, and they heard the sound of children laughing outside the screen door that went from the living room to outside the apartment. Then they heard the sound of a cat hissing and growling, which was followed by a thud, and a brief moment of silence before they could hear these children laughing and running away. They went outside to inspect, and all they could see was a small patch of blood on the wall, with some fur stuck to it. They searched, but they never found the kids, or their cat. They could have concluded that it was just children playing a game that went too far, resulting in the death of an innocent animal, but with everything that had happened before and what followed, drew the couple to the conclusion that what happened was the beginning of a new type of attack. The children would return frequently. They would always be heard, but never seen, laughing loudly outside their screen window or in the corridor outside the front door to the apartment. They would also hear thumping sounds against the walls of the apartment, as if they were throwing something hard and heavy against them. Gideon would run out to see what they were up to, and every time would find nothing. Eventually, things became too much for the couple, and when Gideon had finished school, he and Melissa decided it would be best for them to move from Grafton to Pennsylvania, where Melissa's family lived. One evening, a week before they moved, the couple ran out of cigarettes. The local gas station was walking distance, so Gideon went out to purchase some more. The walk there took them through a walkway with storage units that belonged to the apartment complex on the other side. Ahead of him, he saw shadows stretching around from the corner in front of him, and he heard the children laughing. When he turned the corner, he saw nothing. Gideon continued to the gas station and returned home with a fresh pack of cigarettes. When he arrived, he found Melissa visibly shaken in the apartment. As soon as Gideon had left, the apartment lights had started to flash on and off. The noise returned to an unbearable volume. Melissa tried to leave the apartment, but her efforts were prevented from the door being stuck and unable to open. Everything ceased as soon as Gideon returned. On their last night in the apartment, they had some friends come over to spend one more evening with them before they left town. They all went for a walk, and were only 300 feet from their apartment when they all heard a sound filling the whole area. It was that same sound they heard in the bedroom, the sound of someone running a fingernail down a comb. One of their friends let out a gasp, looking on the top of one of the buildings close to their apartment complex. They claimed they saw something, a figure maybe, move and disappear from sight. They quickly returned and went inside the apartment. Gideon and Melissa never slept that night. They were kept up by the sound, which was at its highest volume and moving around the apartment. They lay there awake, and when the sun eventually started to rise, was when the sound began to fade. They packed up and left the apartment, and that was the last they experienced of these unexplained occurrences. So this was not your average haunting due to the fact that there were many different unexplainable occurrences. The sound without a source, the woman staring from her window, the children under the influence of a negative force, and the strange dog-like creature all point towards one thing: a skinwalker. Skinwalkers derive from Navajo culture and are considered to be witches who can possess or transition into animals. Perhaps this particular skinwalker was, for whatever reason, unhappy with the arrival of Melissa, a stranger in the town, and used its influence to drive the couple away. If that is the case, it certainly worked. This story was based on true events and was adapted, narrated, and produced by me, James Deverell. This episode marks the end of this pilot season for this podcast. I have a number of ideas where I want to go with this podcast that include making each episode longer in length, uploading on a more frequent basis, ideally one episode every 2 weeks, adding some original music, and that sort of thing. If you enjoy this pilot season and are hungry for more, there's a few things you can do to help me get to the stage where I can put out more content. Firstly, please subscribe to the podcast and leave me a positive review. This will obviously help me to gain more of a following on the major podcast platforms. Secondly, if you really want to go the extra mile, you can become a contributor over on my Patreon account. For just $5 per month, you will not only get access to the podcast ad-free as I release new episodes, but you will also gain access to an exclusive audio feed of me going over potential stories to feature, interviews with people involved in the podcast, plus access to any potential video footage or photographs of the locations of where the paranormal events occurred. In addition to this, I will give you the chance to contribute by helping me pick stories to feature in future episodes. I'll include a link to the account in the description to this episode. Thank you again for listening. I hope to be back soon.